Every evening, my daughter-in-law pretended not to notice as I cooked, as I dressed the salad by hand, as I baked bread using my mother's recipe. She would laugh and say things like, "Homemade is for people with too much time." At family dinners, she pushed my food aside, ordered delivery, and said, "Everyone eats what I bring anyway." And then, one day, I opened YouTube. I heard, "This recipe is from my grandma. She taught me everything I know." On the screen, my pie, my hands, my presentation. Only the name was his. Until he corrected it. Live on air. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Gladys Holden. I was 68 years old when I moved into my son's home just outside Madison, Wisconsin. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind where each mailbox looked like the next, and porch lights flickered on in perfect rhythm every evening. It wasn't a place I ever imagined myself ending up, but life has a strange way of deciding for you. After I retired from 37 years working as a public school cafeteria cook, I thought I'd spend my days in the house my late husband and I built together. But when the plumbing started failing and the roof needed repair I couldn't afford, my son, Evan, offered a solution. He had a young daughter, a busy wife, and a full-time job. I would be a help to them, and in return, I would have company and a roof that didn't leak. It sounded fair. I was never one to intrude. I came with only what I needed: my books, my kitchen knives, my linens, and one heavy box of handwritten recipes. I had copied every one of them from my mother's old binder, and over the years added dozens of my own. My hands had muscle memory: how to fold butter into dough, how to test the heat of oil with just a pinch of flour, how to tell if a roast was done by the smell alone. I didn't have much in the way of modern skills, but I could feed a crowd with little more than flour, salt, and fat. Their house was different. It was clean in a way that felt sterile. No magnets on the fridge, no cookbooks on the counter, no aprons hanging near the stove. The pantry was alphabetized. The spice rack held identical glass jars with printed labels. I didn't see cinnamon sticks or bay leaves, only pre-measured blends in sleek plastic packets. Still, I reminded myself I was there to adjust, not to critique. At first, I cooked simple things: chicken soup, cornbread, baked oatmeal with apples and brown sugar. My granddaughter Sarah liked the oatmeal. She asked me once why it tasted like Christmas. I told her it was because I used cardamom and orange zest. She didn't know what cardamom was, but she asked me to make it again. It was my daughter-in-law, Madison, who began to make things feel delicate. She was polite, but the kind of polite that settled like a damp cloth on your shoulders. She always smiled when I cooked, but never ate what I made. She would pull out her meal prep containers after I set the table: salmon with quinoa, green juice in a mason jar. She would comment on how heavy Southern cooking was and how her trainer had her avoiding inflammatory ingredients. I pretended not to notice. I made my meals smaller, lighter. I began substituting olive oil for butter, cutting back on sugar, baking instead of frying. Still, she never touched anything I made. She ordered dinner in when friends came over. I stayed in my room on those nights watching TV on low volume, pretending I wasn't there. Evan said nothing. He was always busy, working, commuting, managing meetings from the living room with earbuds in. He kissed me on the cheek every morning, but I could feel the distance. Over time, the kitchen changed. The drawers were reorganized. My knives were moved to the back. My mixing bowls were replaced by a set of modern glass ones with matching lids. The old cast iron skillet I brought with me from my house disappeared altogether. Madison bought a sleek ceramic one and left it out on the stove with a tag still on it for 2 weeks. I didn't ask questions. I baked less. I chopped less. I did what I could without being noticed. I began to cook early in the morning before anyone else was up. It was my way of holding on to the rhythm I had known for so long. I would make biscuits or banana bread and leave them on the counter. Sometimes they disappeared. Sometimes they didn't. I stopped checking. I cooked for the sake of cooking, not for praise. The house smelled different when I was in the kitchen. Cinnamon, cloves, onions sautéed in butter. It was the only way I could feel like myself. I spent afternoons walking around the block or reading on the back patio. Madison worked remotely and often held meetings with her door open. I could hear her laugh in that forced, professional way that made her seem like someone else entirely. At dinner, she would plate salads with seeds and fruit, drizzle them with dressing she made from scratch. The rest of us would sit in silence while she talked about hormones, clean eating, and gut health. When I offered to bring mashed potatoes or roasted chicken, she would say, "No need, Gladys, it's handled." So I learned not to offer. Still, I couldn't help myself on holidays. Thanksgiving came, and I woke before the sun. I roasted turkey legs with rosemary and garlic, made cornbread stuffing, candied sweet potatoes, and a lattice-top apple pie. I didn't ask permission. I just cooked. The smells filled the house. Sarah stood in the hallway sniffing, her eyes wide. But at dinner, only Madison's food was served. My dishes were pushed to the far counter, covered in foil, untouched. I sat at the end of the table, next to Sarah, who leaned toward me and whispered, "Can I have your pie later?" I smiled, nodded, and said nothing. Evan made a toast, thanking Madison for organizing such a beautiful holiday. My name was not mentioned. I cleaned the kitchen that night alone. The pie was gone by morning. There was something intimate about a kitchen. To me, it had always been the most sacred space in a home. More than the bedroom, more than the front porch, more than the polished coffee table that people wiped down before guests arrived. A kitchen was where a family's truth lived. The rhythm of pots and pans, the scent of bread rising, the hiss of something hitting oil, it all meant life was happening. Food meant care, and in my world, care was never abstract. But in Madison's house, the kitchen belonged to no one. Or rather, it belonged to a version of family that didn't need flour on its counters or fingerprints on the fridge. It was a showroom kitchen, white granite, steel appliances that beeped instead of clicked, a set of knives on a magnetic strip that looked like sculpture. It had no soul. And I tried not to take that personally. But I did. I told myself I could adapt, that I didn't need to bring my whole self to the stove. So I adjusted. I woke earlier. I made smaller meals. I prepped on the patio table when I sensed I was in her way. But no matter how much I stepped back, she always seemed to step further in. She started reorganizing the pantry, labels, shelves by category, containers with dates written in dry erase marker. At first, I was impressed. Then I realized my flour had been tossed. The brown paper bag replaced with a plastic bin labeled organic oat flour. I didn't say a word. I just bought more. She began announcing what we were avoiding that week. Gluten, nightshades, dairy, sugar. She never directed it at me, but she spoke loudly enough that I heard. I watched her slide my butter to the back of the fridge. I noticed her separate pans for clean cooking. I saw her glance at the meals I made with the kind of strained smile people give to strangers handing out flyers. I was becoming the background, expected but unnecessary. My recipes began to feel like secrets. I stopped leaving them on the fridge or writing them down where they could be seen. I kept my small spiral notebook in the nightstand drawer, jotting things down in pencil before bed. I didn't want her to critique the way I measured by touch, the way I adjusted flavor without teaspoons. She believed in metrics. I believed in memory. and that difference grew between us like a closed door. Still, I didn't stop cooking. I simply stopped asking who it was for. I made stews and soups and pies and wrapped them in foil. I stored them in the freezer downstairs, the one no one else used. I labeled nothing. I waited for no compliments. Sometimes, after everyone had gone to bed, I would reheat a small portion for myself and eat it at the kitchen island in silence. I told myself it was enough, but I would be lying if I said it didn't hurt. She began bringing in prepped meals from a service she followed online. Boxes with labeled containers arrived every Monday, meals organized by macros. She said it saved time and prevented emotional eating. The phrase made me wince. All eating was emotional to me. A roast wasn't just meat, it was comfort. A pie wasn't dessert, it was gratitude. To her, food was fuel. To me, it was everything else. One evening, she had a group of friends over for a clean wine and cleanse night. I was asked, politely, to stay upstairs. They were filming something for social media. I could hear them through the vent, laughing, clinking glasses, talking about detoxes and intention setting. I sat in the guest room, crocheting something I didn't need, with the TV muted. At one point, I smelled something burning. I came down later to find kale chips charred in the oven and my baking tray thrown into the sink. I washed it, silently. The worst part wasn't the exclusion, it was the revision, the rewriting of presents. When Madison's friends asked who made the lasagna at last month's gathering, she said she found the recipe online. It was mine. I had made it the night before. I remembered layering it while Sarah colored at the table. I remembered the fresh basil from the garden. I remembered pulling it from the oven just as Evan walked in. But the credit was redirected with a shrug, and no one questioned it. I found myself growing smaller in that kitchen, my movements quieter. I didn't want to bump into anyone. I didn't want to leave behind smells that lingered. I started burning candles when I cooked, not for ambiance, but to mask the scent. I didn't want to give her another reason to roll her eyes. Sometimes Sarah would sneak in and ask for my banana bread. She called it the secret loaf because I would wrap a slice in a napkin and tuck it into her backpack for school. She said her friends asked where she got it. She never said my name. She just smiled. I didn't blame her. Children learn early what's safe to share and what's better kept inside. I continued making meals with names no one spoke. I called them nothing. I made them without history, without reference. But inside me, each dish carried years. My mother's hands, my husband's favorite breakfast, the recipe card stained with oil from 1979. But there was no space for that in this house, no shelf for memory. So I held it all inside. The taste of real broth, the weight of good dough, the memory of being someone who mattered at the stove. And in the quiet moments before sunrise or long after dinner, I still found my way back to the cutting board, the skillet, the bowl, even if no one watched, even if no one cared, even if the kitchen wasn't mine. It started gradually, like most endings do. One evening, I noticed the sound of plastic bags rustling at the front door. A delivery driver handed over a stack of containers, and Madison greeted him with the bright tone she reserved for people outside the house. Evan stood behind her, scrolling on his phone. I stood in the kitchen, wiping down the counter after baking a fresh batch of cornbread. The smell of butter and cornmeal still hung in the air, but no one commented on it. Instead, they carried the containers to the dining table, peeled off the lids, and began plating portions with clinical precision. Grilled salmon, quinoa, avocado slices arranged in neat spirals. My casserole remained untouched on the stove, still warm, still waiting. At first, they told me it was a trial week, something Madison wanted to try to simplify evenings. Then it became a routine. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, a new shipment arrived. Salads with tiny plastic cups of dressing, wraps with chicken seasoned in unfamiliar spices, vegan bowls layered with ingredients I didn't recognize, their fridge filled with barcoded containers, and the scent of reheated delivery replaced the earthy richness of home-cooked meals. I adapted the only way I knew how, by cooking less. I started making small portions just for myself, a single chicken thigh with roasted carrots, a bowl of lentil soup, toasted sourdough with goat cheese and honey. I ate at the kitchen island, alone, while the others discussed the macros of their meals or how fresh everything tasted. Sometimes I sat outside with my plate, pretending I wanted the fresh air. Madison began posting pictures of their dinners on social media, captions about health, balance, intentional eating. In the background of one photo, my half-covered pie dish sat at the edge of the counter, cropped out but still visible if you looked closely. No one commented on it. No one ever asked if I had made anything. It wasn't just the meals that changed. It was the language. Madison no longer asked me if I was hungry. She asked if I was joining them. If I said no, she nodded politely and continued unwrapping her food. If I said yes, she offered a clean plate, never mine, and passed me a container of something cold and unfamiliar. I learned to decline. Sarah, sweet and observant, started sneaking bites from my plate. She'd wander into the kitchen while I cooked, pretending to need a glass of water. Her fingers would hover near the edge of the cutting board, and I'd slide her a small piece of bread or a spoonful of soup. She never said thank you out loud, but her smile was enough. At school, she once told her teacher her favorite food was Grandma's yellow chicken, a name she gave my turmeric-spiced thighs. Madison corrected her later, calling it rotisserie style. I didn't argue. I just wrote the phrase down in my notebook under the recipe. Grandma's yellow chicken, with a date beside it. That was enough for me. More weeks passed. I stopped using the main fridge and started keeping my groceries in a small cooler I placed on the back porch. It was easier than playing refrigerator Tetris with stacks of containers. No one asked about it. No one noticed. Or maybe they did and decided it was easier not to say anything. That's how it was in that house. Silences wrapped in courtesy. I kept baking, though. I couldn't help myself. There was a rhythm to it, a familiarity that nothing else could replace. I made banana bread with walnuts and honey. I baked peach cobbler on rainy afternoons. I kneaded dough for sandwich rolls just to feel the stretch under my palms. I didn't announce any of it. I just left things on the counter. Sometimes they vanished. Sometimes they didn't. But I never asked. One evening, I made my mother's corned beef hash. The smell filled the house. It was rich, savory, deeply nostalgic. I sat down at the island and ate slowly, savoring every bite. Evan walked in halfway through and paused. He didn't say anything, but I saw his eyes drift toward my plate. He used to love that dish. I waited for a word, even a glance of recognition. Instead, he picked up a delivery bag from the table and left the room. I finished my dinner in silence. I began to feel like an artifact, present but from another era, a person to be treated gently, like an old photo that might tear if held too long. They didn't mock me. They didn't scold. They simply erased, bit by bit, until I was more habit than human. I went to bed earlier. I stayed in my room longer. I kept the television volume low and my footsteps softer. I didn't want to interrupt their clean, curated life with my heavy flavors and warm sauces. And yet, I couldn't stop cooking. I didn't cook for them. I cooked for the girl I used to be, the one who sat on a stool beside her mother, learning to peel apples without breaking the skin. I cooked for the woman who fed 3 children on 1 chicken and a bag of rice. I cooked for the part of me that still believed food meant love, even if no one else at that table did. I started leaving slices of pie on the porch swing, a habit, a ritual. Sometimes they were gone by morning, sometimes not. I never looked at the camera. I never asked who took them, but I always made another the following week because something in me still believes someone out there might be hungry for something real. It was a Saturday afternoon in early fall when he first asked about the pie. I had just taken it out of the oven, and the scent of cinnamon and browned butter filled the kitchen in a way that made the house feel older than it was. The crust was flaking in all the right places, bubbling slightly around the edges, just as my mother had taught me. I set it on the counter to cool, next to the open window, where the breeze could carry the smell to whoever still noticed such things. Evan's nephew, Jordan, was visiting that weekend. A quiet young man in his early 20s, he was the type who rarely looked up from his phone, yet still managed to listen to everything. He had come down from college for the break, and though he said little during meals, I caught him watching me when I moved around the kitchen. Not in a rude or invasive way, more like someone trying to understand something they'd never been taught. He lingered in the doorway that day, eyes flicking between the pie and the notepad I kept tucked beneath the fruit bowl. It was where I scribbled thoughts and reminders, measurements I never measured, flavor combinations I wanted to try. He asked if the pie was store-bought. I shook my head. I think that surprised him. Later that evening, while the others scrolled through their phones in the living room, he returned to the kitchen. He asked what was in the crust. I told him, briefly, without ceremony. He nodded, then stood there for a while, as if trying to memorize the details just from smell alone. Before he went to bed, I noticed a folded piece of paper missing from the edge of my notepad. The next week, I forgot about it. The house returned to its usual rhythm of deliveries and detachment. Madison mentioned a cleanse she wanted to try, and Evan adjusted his schedule to work longer hours. I kept cooking in the background, preparing quiet meals that often went uneaten. My days felt small, wrapped in routines no one noticed, but I still baked, always. Then, one afternoon, while sipping tea on the porch, I opened YouTube on my tablet. I don't remember what I was looking for, probably a video about pruning hydrangeas, but an unexpected thumbnail caught my eye. It was Jordan, in my kitchen, standing awkwardly but sincerely in front of the stove. The title read, "My Grandmother's Pie Recipe, Sort of." I clicked. The video was unpolished. He stammered, forgot steps, spilled flour. But I watched every second. There was my mixing bowl, the chipped one I refused to throw out. There was my rolling pin, the one with the worn wooden handles. He even used the same dish towel I always folded in half when setting pies to cool. His hands weren't practiced, but they moved with intention. He narrated quietly, almost reverently, like someone reciting something sacred. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Every movement told the story. He followed my notes exactly, right down to brushing the crust with milk instead of egg, because milk browns softer. When he took the finished pie out of the oven, his face lit up like a child's. He tasted it, nodded slowly, and said it reminded him of something he'd never had, but somehow missed. That line stayed with me. The comments were sparse. He didn't have many followers yet, but the few that were there sounded like old souls. People thanking him for slowing down, for not rushing through the process. A woman wrote that it reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. A man said it was the first time he'd watched a video and felt calm instead of hungry. I read every word, twice. I didn't tell anyone I saw it. I didn't mention it when he came back a few weeks later, but I left my notepad out on the counter with a corner turned down, open to the biscuit recipe he'd been eyeing last time. It was gone by morning. The next video came 2 weeks later, biscuits and honey butter. This time he smiled more. This time he called it a recipe passed down, not written down. He had found something, and through him so had I. There was a small comfort in knowing that even if the people closest to me no longer asked for my food, someone else saw it. Someone else was paying attention. Not to me exactly, but to the care inside the crust, the pause before slicing, the reverence in the way a dish is carried to the table. Jordan began uploading weekly. His editing improved, his lighting got better. But he never polished the tone too much. He kept the pauses, the quiet moments, the little flower disasters. He left in the parts where he hesitated, laughed nervously, or got the measurements wrong. And always in the background were small pieces of my kitchen, my world, repurposed. I watched everyone, not out of pride, but out of recognition. There's something powerful in knowing you've planted something that grew even when no one watered it. I never commented. I never liked the videos. I just watched, and I baked, and I waited. Not for applause, not for validation, but for the sound of footsteps coming back into the kitchen, not with critique, but with curiosity. The first time I realized something had shifted, it wasn't from a phone call or a knock on the door. It was from a comment section. I had taken to watching Jordan's videos in the evenings, sometimes with a cup of chamomile tea, sometimes while folding laundry. His channel had grown steadily, then suddenly. One day there were 24 comments, the next there were hundreds. By the end of the month, there were thousands. I read them slowly, my finger moving down the screen line by line, like I used to track recipes in cookbooks. People were sharing their own versions of the pie. They were writing about their childhood kitchens, about grandmothers they missed, about how his hands reminded them of someone else's. A few asked who the original recipe came from. He never answered directly, but the way he filmed, the way he always included the sound of the knife slicing through crust, the pause before tasting, those were answers in themselves. I recognized my own rhythms in him, the measured way he stirred, the fact that he never said perfect, only real. He didn't perform the recipe, he lived it. There was a difference. Then came the features. Other creators started mentioning him. Articles appeared on blogs about slow food and honest cooking. A short segment ran on a morning show that Evan sometimes watched in the background while getting ready for work. I heard Jordan's name and looked up. There he was, smiling shyly, holding a pie like it was made of glass. They called him refreshing, authentic, a throwback to real kitchens. I sat very still, listening to phrases I hadn't heard in years. Phrases that once belonged to my world, my generation, my way of doing things. He still hadn't said my name, but I didn't mind. There was something almost sacred about the anonymity. My recipes weren't brand marked or monetized. They were living things now, moving through the world in new hands. In our house, little changed. Madison continued her rotations of meal kits and powdered nutrition. Evan smiled vaguely when Sarah mentioned how much she liked that cooking guy. I doubt he connected the dots. Or maybe he did and chose not to. Either way, the topic never came up at dinner. But something strange began to happen. Friends of Madison's started forwarding her the videos. She mentioned it offhand one day, laughing about how the algorithm must think I'm into comfort food. I said nothing, but inside I smiled because I had spent years trying to fit into their system, and now their system had bent slightly to make room for me. I watched as the algorithm did what people around me never had. It recognized consistency. It noticed patience. It valued the imperfect, the handwritten, the humble. Jordan's most viewed video was a biscuit tutorial he filmed in silence, set to the sound of a ticking kitchen clock and birds outside the window. There were no cuts, no edits, just the process. I watched it twice that day, not because I needed to learn, but because I had never seen something so quiet be so heard. He started getting sponsorship offers. I could tell by the way he carefully mentioned new ingredients, subtly acknowledged certain brands, but he never let it take over. His apron stayed stained. His lighting stayed soft. The flour on the counter remained unswept until the very end. He emailed me once, not directly, but through Evan, a vague message about appreciation, about learning, about wanting to do something right. I never responded. I didn't need to. The videos were enough. They were more honest than most conversations I'd had in years. I began to notice strangers using my techniques, folding dough a certain way, sprinkling sugar on crusts before baking, letting soup rest before serving. I could tell who had watched and who had only copied, and I found joy in the ones who understood. Sometimes I wondered if Madison knew, if she ever connected the pie on her feed to the scent in her kitchen, if she ever realized that the man being praised for authenticity had learned in silence, standing 3 feet away from her while she ordered salad through an app. I would catch her watching the videos occasionally, never for long, but long enough. She never said anything. She never asked questions. But once, I saw her try to make biscuits. She used the wrong flour, rolled the dough too thin, baked them on a silicone mat that made the bottoms sweat instead of brown. She didn't finish them. They sat on the counter for a full day before disappearing. I said nothing, but I left a real batch on the table the next morning, still warm. Sarah noticed. She always noticed. She started helping me more in the kitchen. She asked why I didn't have my own channel. I told her not everything needed to be filmed. Some things were meant to be remembered, not recorded. She didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. I realized then that the algorithms were catching up to something I had always known, that taste doesn't follow trends, that real food made with care always finds a way back, even if it takes years, even if it comes through someone else's voice, even if your name is never printed beneath the video. I continued baking, continued jotting notes in the margin of my recipe book, continued watching quietly as something I thought had been forgotten moved out into the world and made itself known again. Not through force, not through marketing, but through truth. Because taste, like memory, doesn't need permission to last. I woke up early that morning, long before the sun had climbed over the rooftops. The house was quiet, still wrapped in sleep. Even the birds outside seemed hesitant to break the silence. I moved through the kitchen slowly, not out of fatigue, but ceremony. I brewed my tea, the same blend I had made for years, black with a dash of clove, and sat by the window while it steeped. The television remote rested on the table next to me, untouched, but waiting. The night before, Jordan had posted a short announcement. He was going live. A morning show had invited him for a segment. It wasn't clear whether he'd be cooking, speaking, or simply standing beside someone else's words, but it didn't matter. I knew what it meant. He was stepping out from behind the camera, stepping forward into a space where many voices talked over each other, and somehow he had brought mine with him. At 8 a.m. sharp, I turned on the television. The show's theme song blared through the speakers, too bright and too eager, but I didn't mind. I turned down the volume and waited. Segments passed quickly: weather, health trends, a celebrity interview I barely registered. Then the anchor smiled, and a new title rolled across the bottom of the screen: The Soul of Slow Food. Meet the YouTube chef bringing Grandma's kitchen back to life. And there he was. Jordan stood beside the host in a studio kitchen that looked too perfect to be real. His posture was stiff at first, his hands clasped together, unsure of where to rest. But when he spoke, his voice settled into the soft, unpolished cadence I recognized. He talked about starting his channel, about how cooking gave him structure and calm when everything else felt noisy. He mentioned learning to slow down, not because it was trendy, but because someone once taught him that patience had flavor. I watched him reach for ingredients like they mattered. He prepared dough with measured hands, explained why butter should be cold, why you let the dough rest before cutting. He rolled it out on a floured surface while the host asked questions that didn't quite land. He smiled through them, gracious but focused. And when he cut the biscuits and placed them on a pan, he did it in the exact pattern I always used. One in the center, the rest spiraling outward, not for efficiency, but for balance. Then came the moment. The host, in a bright tone reserved for reveals, asked him who had taught him to cook. I held my breath. He paused, not long, but noticeably. He looked off camera for a second, then back. He said he had learned from someone who didn't know she was teaching, someone who never asked for credit, who just cooked because that's how she spoke love. He said the recipes weren't written in cookbooks, but in the corners of memory. That they came with the smell of vanilla, the sound of chopping, the feeling of being fed without needing to ask. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. The camera zoomed in on the biscuits as he pulled them from the oven, golden, uneven, imperfect in all the right ways. He split one open and added a pat of butter. The host tasted it, closed her eyes dramatically, and said it reminded her of her childhood. Jordan smiled again, a little wider this time. The segment ended with applause from the off-screen crew. The host thanked him for bringing heart back into the kitchen. The screen faded to a commercial, and I turned off the TV. I didn't move for a while. I just sat there, hands wrapped around my mug, letting the warmth sink in, not from the tea, but from the feeling of being seen, even if no one else watching knew it. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about legacy. It was about transmission. Something had passed from my hands to his, and now into the world. Not a recipe, but a way. That afternoon, Evan came home early. He said little, as usual, but mentioned he'd seen Jordan on TV. Madison didn't say anything at all. At dinner, she served pre-packed kale salad with lemon tahini dressing. No one brought up the show. No one acknowledged the biscuits I had baked and left on the counter. But Sarah took one without asking, added a little jam, and gave me a smile so quick it almost vanished. Almost. Later that night, I found a note slipped under my bedroom door, a small scrap of paper torn from a notebook, with a single sentence written in neat, all-caps letters. "Your crust is better than mine. Thank you." No signature. I folded the note and placed it in my recipe book, next to a faded clipping of the first article that had ever mentioned my son when he made the honor roll in 8th grade. Different names, different kinds of pride, but the same warmth. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because in the quiet flicker of a television screen, in a studio kitchen hundreds of miles away, a boy I barely knew had spoken for me, and for once, everyone had heard. The day after the broadcast, the house felt heavier in a way I couldn't quite name. The silence wasn't louder, but it had a texture now, dense, full of unspoken things. I moved through the kitchen like always, cleaning up from breakfast, wiping down the counter that no one else ever seemed to notice needed wiping. The television was off. Phones were face down. No one brought it up. Madison sat at the dining table with her laptop open, eating one of her store-bought salads straight from the plastic bowl. She had a call scheduled for later that morning and was dressed in her usual neutral palette. Perfect, composed, untouchable. She didn't look at me when I walked past her. I didn't expect her to. The air between us wasn't cold exactly, just settled, like dust that no longer tried to rise. Evan kissed Sarah goodbye and left for work without lingering. He said nothing about the show. He didn't mention Jordan. He didn't mention the biscuits I had baked again that morning, left on a plate near the coffee pot where he usually made his travel mug. I noticed he took one anyway. No words, just a quiet, practiced motion. I sat in the sunroom after the kitchen was clean. I liked that space. The light came in slow and generous, and I could watch the breeze nudge the trees without having to speak. I brought my tea and a small piece of pie I'd saved from the weekend, wrapped in wax paper the way my mother used to. It tasted better outside. Everything did. In the early afternoon, I checked Jordan's channel. The live segment had been clipped and uploaded. Already the views were climbing, hundreds turning to thousands, comments stacking up like fallen leaves. People wrote about the calm he brought to their screens, how refreshing it was to see someone cook without ego, without noise. One woman shared that she watched the biscuit segment with her mother, and they both cried. I sat with that comment longer than the others. I didn't respond. I never did. But I read each one, slowly, sometimes twice. I imagined their kitchens. I imagined their hands covered in flour, unsure at first, but growing more certain with every batch. I imagined how their homes smelled when the timer went off, and how someone down the hallway would ask, "What's that?" The mail came late that day. Inside the stack was a thin envelope addressed to me. I recognized the handwriting. It was Jordan's. He didn't say much, just a short note thanking me, written in pen, not typed. He said he had a few offers now, that people wanted him to write a cookbook. He wasn't sure yet, but if he did, he said he hoped it would carry the spirit of what he learned in my kitchen. Not the measurements, not the flour ratios, but the way to wait, the way to listen to the dough, the way to know something was ready without needing a timer. I placed the letter in the drawer with the others. Old holiday cards, Evan's crayon drawings from when he was 6, a grocery list my husband had written on the back of a napkin once, misspelling cinnamon. The drawer of small things that carried weight. That night, dinner was quiet. Madison plated her meal first, as always. Sarah made herself a sandwich. I had prepared roasted vegetables and a small pot of lentil soup. No one asked where the recipe came from. No one commented on the smell. The food sat on the table, warm and willing, untouched by judgment. Evan's phone buzzed during dinner. He glanced at it, then at me. He said softly that Jordan had been invited to another show. This time it would be a full segment, longer, maybe even national. He didn't say it like news. He said it like an apology. I nodded. Madison said nothing. She finished her salad, closed her laptop, and excused herself before dessert. There was nothing harsh in the way she moved, just final, like someone closing a door and locking it from the inside. I stayed at the table, slowly sipping a second cup of tea. Sarah helped me clear the dishes. She didn't ask about the show, but she smiled in a way that told me she'd seen it. Maybe even twice. I didn't ask. Some acknowledgments don't arrive in words. Some settle in small gestures. A plate left clean, a slice of pie missing from the counter, a note in a backpack that says, "Can we bake this weekend?" She didn't need to say anything. I saw it in the way she lingered in the kitchen a little longer than usual, in the way her fingers brushed the flour bag I left near the edge of the counter. Later, I sat outside on the porch, the cool air brushing against my neck. I looked at the sky, the soft pinks folding into each other like icing. I didn't need to be mentioned. I didn't need my name on a screen. The story had already found its way. Through butter and salt, through heat and patience, through hands that didn't rush. And now it lived where it needed to. Some things aren't meant to be discussed. They're meant to be known. The mornings became my sanctuary. While the house still slept, I moved quietly through the kitchen, each motion deliberate and familiar. I no longer had to compete for space. The silence became my companion, not a void, but a gentle permission to do things my way. I opened the window, let the cool breeze in, and began baking. Not for anyone in particular, certainly not for praise, but because the act itself had become a kind of language I spoke when words failed. I started working on a variation of my cornbread, softer, sweeter, with a touch of honey and a dusting of sea salt, the kind of flavor that stayed on the tongue long after the bite was gone. I wrote nothing down, testing and tweaking by feel. Some mornings it came out too dry, others too soft. But the process soothed me. I wrapped each batch in parchment, left them on the windowsill, or tucked them into small tins on the back porch bench. No names, no notes, just offerings. Eventually, they disappeared. One day, a letter arrived. It wasn't from a family member or even someone I knew personally. It was from a representative at a culinary content company based in Los Angeles. They said they worked with Jordan and were developing a campaign to highlight traditional home cooking from overlooked voices. They asked if I'd be willing to license a recipe. They wanted something authentic, nostalgic, and rooted in story. I read the letter twice before folding it neatly and placing it beside my rolling pin. Later that afternoon, I responded in my own handwriting. I chose one recipe, not the pie, not the biscuits, not the soup. Those were still mine in a way I wasn't ready to share. I sent them the honey cornbread. I gave them the basics in a short note. The trick is not to overmix and never rush it. Let the kitchen smell full before you open the oven. That was all. A week later, they replied. They wanted to use it in a holiday campaign. It would be labeled Gladys Classic Crust. They asked if I wanted a photo, a story attached, or a link to a personal page. I declined. I asked only that they keep the name as written. No changes, no additions. I didn't tell Evan. I didn't tell Madison. I didn't tell Sarah either, though I noticed her watching me more closely as I measured, sifted, and stirred. One afternoon, she pulled out her own notebook and asked if she could write things down. I handed her a pencil and nodded. We didn't speak much, but her eyes followed every step. I let her knead the dough. She smiled at the stickiness, the texture. I showed her how to know when it was ready, not by time, but by feel. She understood. Children always did. The campaign launched quietly. A few sponsored posts, a recipe page online. Nothing flashy, but the name was there. My name, not tucked away or half-spoken. It was in the headline, bold, firm, Gladys's Classic Crust. I printed it out, taped it inside my recipe book, not for display, but for safekeeping. A quiet proof. I kept baking, kept leaving things behind. A neighbor I'd only waved at before left a thank you card in my mailbox. She didn't say what it was for. She didn't need to. The note inside read, "Please don't stop." I didn't plan to. Madison never acknowledged the campaign. She must have seen it. Her feeds were curated, efficient. Nothing trended without her knowing. But she said nothing. The tension between us didn't shift, but it didn't harden either. We passed each other in the hallway like two people who had once been strangers and chosen to stay that way. It didn't hurt anymore. The kitchen was still hers by design, but it had quietly become mine by ritual. My mixing bowls lived in the same cabinet. My flour stayed on the same shelf. The scent of butter and sugar lingered longer after I baked, as if the air itself was beginning to favor my presence. One morning, I found Sarah sitting at the table before school, holding a folded index card. On it, in her small handwriting, she'd copied my cornbread recipe. At the top, she'd written, "Secret recipe from Grandma." She didn't ask me to review it. She just smiled and tucked it into her backpack. I said nothing, but I turned back to the stove and added more honey to the next batch. I realized then that secrets weren't always hidden. Sometimes they were just waiting to be noticed, waiting to be passed along, not through fanfare, but through repetition, through memory, through hands that cared enough to remember. The home wasn't built in the walls or the blueprints. It was in these small exchanges, in what we left behind on purpose. By then, I had stopped hoping to be part of conversations. I had learned the language of presence, and in that quiet, I found something that no one else in the house could claim. Not ownership of the kitchen, not recognition on the screen, but something simpler and maybe stronger. A legacy built not on names, but on scent, on taste, on knowing someone had been here and fed you and left behind something good.